Good day. Today, 24th October 2023, we continue to find ourselves in what is now the third week of this latest war in the Middle East, because it seems to me that that is what it is, this latest war between Israel and the Palestinians, which has been ongoing since the 7th of October. Of course, there will be many people, especially in what are called the Palestinian territories, who will say that the war has been continuous for decades and it really makes little sense to separate it, to segment it, and to say that particular incidents, particular periods of time are war, because that would imply that times when, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, there is less news coming from this part of the world, that is a time of peace. Those people who would criticize that would say that in reality, there has never been peace, at least no real peace, since, well, arguably the events of the 1940s, the original conflict which led to the foundation of the State of Israel. Well, for the purpose of this program, I will continue to speak about this latest flare-up, if you like, in this conflict as the war that began on the 7th of October. But it is important always to be aware that there is this perspective, this alternative perspective, or rather maybe not alternative perspective, this perspective, which is the one that is felt by many of the people who actually live there, who live in the region. But anyway, we are now in the third week rather, of this conflict, of this latest flare-up in this conflict, of this war, which began on the 7th of October. And despite reports that I saw yesterday, late in the evening, that a major Israeli military operation had begun, that Israeli troops had actually begun to enter Gaza, it is clear that for the moment nothing like that has happened. And the big Israeli military operation, the Israeli advance into Gaza, continues to be delayed. There's been pictures of large numbers of tanks and armored vehicles assembling, of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Israeli troops assembling. But that incursion has not yet begun. That outright invasion of Gaza has not yet begun. And there are, however, telltale signs that suggest that something is going to happen, that this is an unstable period before the incursion, the proper incursion, begins. And there's been reports in the New York Times that the United States is now sending to Israel specialists, officers, military officers with actual experience of street fighting obtained in the Middle East in the battles of Fallujah and Mosul and Raqqa and other places, and that they're coming to the Middle East, to Israel, to try to give advice to the Israelis about what to do. But elsewhere in the New York Times, there are other reports which say that, for the moment at least, the US is still uncertain about what is Israel's actual plan for the military campaign. They are uncertain exactly how Israel intends to defeat Hamas in Gaza. Behind these kind of reports, one gets a sense of doubt that the objective of fully destroying Hamas in Gaza is achievable, or at least achievable in any way that would not involve enormous civilian casualties. And I've discussed in previous programs the political effect that that would have. And the United States is uncertain exactly what the Israeli strategy is. Is it to launch precision strikes against Hamas positions, Hamas bunkers and tunnels and those sort of things, combined perhaps with raids by special forces, Israeli special forces, into Gaza to track down and eliminate, either kill or capture, Hamas leaders, and perhaps also free hostages? Is that the strategy? Or is there going to be a full-scale ground offensive against Hamas in Gaza, with all the enormous losses that that will cause and the heavy casualties that might result in for the Israeli troops? And the doubts in the United States, apparently, and this again I'm taking from the New York Times, are starting to spread amongst people in Israel. The fact that more than 2 weeks since the start of this war, as I will continue to call it, despite that fact that we are still, more than 2 weeks from that point, and the fact that there has still been no great advance into Gaza, is beginning to create doubts and uncertainty within Israel itself. There have been reminders, no doubt, on the part of some people that in the past all kinds of explanations and excuses were given for the fact that the ground invasion had not yet taken place. At one point it was the weather. At another point I remember that it was the fact that President Biden was visiting Israel, and it was predicted that when President Biden returned to the United States, that would be the moment when the ground invasion would begin. Anyway, these doubts, these concerns about when and whether there is going to be a ground invasion are now starting to spread in Israel itself. And the fact that there are these doubts and these concerns amongst the Israeli public about what exactly the government's plan actually is, well, the fact that these doubts exist is confirmed by rumors that have started to circulate that there are divisions, that there are splits between the Israeli political leadership, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his colleagues in the Israeli government, and of course, and the military themselves, who perhaps have more doubts about this operation than the political leaders do. And the fact that these rumors are circulating and that they're having a political effect is confirmed by the lengths to which the Israeli authorities have had to go to deny them. We've had an array of officials coming forward insisting that these rumors are completely untrue, that there is no dissension or disagreement, that everybody is united and working towards the same end, and presumably following some sort of plan that, of course, we're not being told what that plan is. So, for the moment, no military operation, openly expressed doubts in the United States, rumors of splits in Israel itself, general uncertainty about the whole situation. Now, this is not sustainable. At some point, something has to give. There has to be some decision. Either Israel makes a decision that it is not going to launch a ground operation, in which case it needs to allow the reservists, whose call-up is having a detrimental effect on the Israeli economy, and to return home so that they can re-enter civilian life and stabilize the economy as it needs to be stabilized, or in the alternative, Israel must finally commit to some kind of plan of military action in Gaza, whatever that plan actually is. And it's important to say that even as these delays continue, this uncertainty continues, the missile and bomb attacks on Gaza continue, and of course, so does the blockade. And according to Palestinian authorities, which on this instance I have no reason to doubt, already the numbers of dead in Gaza are numbering in the many thousands, and of course the prospect of a humanitarian crisis within Gaza looms, to the point where, if this continues for very much longer, there will be a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, irrespective of whether Israel launches a ground offensive into Gaza or not. So, as I said, this is unsustainable. Israel will need to make a decision before very long, and I continue to believe that the decision Israel will make will be the one of advancing into Gaza, taking the battle to Hamas, pursuing the objective that Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, have publicly expressed and set for themselves, which is the destruction of Hamas. And, well, we'll have to see whether or not that is achieved or can be achieved in any politically viable time frame. Now, yesterday I was fortunate to participate in a program on X Spaces, hosted by David Sachs and Vivek Ramaswamy. And over the course of that program, I listened very carefully to a breakdown of the military situation, the military challenges which Israel would face, by one of the participants, who was Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. And he describes his description of the challenge, of the military challenge that a ground offensive would involve, I have to say, made it sound to me extraordinarily daunting, even from a military point of view. It didn't seem to me clear what Israel would be able to do in Gaza that would resolve the problem neatly and fast. And Colonel Davis was also skeptical, seemed to me to be very skeptical, that the Israelis would be able to conduct this operation without inflicting very heavy casualties upon the civilian population. Now, it's important to stress that he was not saying that this operation was not doable. My impression was that his views, and you have to go to David Sachs's X Spaces, or space on X, and hear the whole discussion and listen to what Colonel Davis had to say. But my impression is that Colonel Davis accepts that over time, eventually, if Israel has an indefinite amount of time, that this objective can, in the end, be achieved, at least in some form, that Hamas can be defeated and destroyed, perhaps not entirely, but to a very great degree, such as that it would not be able to continue to function as a military organization. What would happen after was, of course, not something that he, as a military person, was there to discuss. But anyway, the point is, how long, how much time would that need? And my impression was that he expected it to take a very long time indeed. And as I've already said in previous programs, Israel does not have an indefinite amount of time to complete an operation of this kind. The longer the operation lasts, the more pictures and films of devastation in Gaza, deaths of civilians circulate, the more difficult politically it will become to sustain an operation like this. Now, I have said for weeks now that Israel needs to think very carefully about what it is doing in Gaza. It needs to calibrate its response extremely carefully, that decisions made in anger and in panic often result in extremely bad outcomes, and ultimately this is a political challenge to which perhaps military means can contribute, but which they cannot in the end solve. Now, in a sense, this advice, which has been echoed by many people, I've discussed how people like Jonathan Friedland, Gideon Rachman, others in the British mainstream media have also been repeating this advice. I've also discussed, well, it's how President Biden himself has appeared to say similar things whilst in Israel also. This advice has been given. What I have been saying is now almost a commonplace. But despite that, and despite the delay, I still don't get the impression that this reality within Israel itself has, for the moment, been internalized. Now, I come back to what I said previously. All of this does assume that Hamas is a viable military force, perhaps not the best trained military force, but one that does have a certain degree of organizational and military resiliency. Perhaps it doesn't, and perhaps this will be an easier operation than I and many others expect. But ultimately, this looks to me like a trap. I think that this is a trap that perhaps Hamas intended to lure Israel into, and I'm not convinced that the Israeli government, for the moment, has grasped that fact and is making its decisions on that basis. So there's been a delay, perhaps because of concerns on the part of military officials. I suspect more because of the need to give time for further military deployments, not just by Israel, but also by the United States, as I discussed in my program yesterday. We've seen that the US is sending its people to advise Israel, even despite the doubts the US government itself has. Apparently, it continues to support Israel in whatever it is that Israel is going to do, which, to be straightforward, I find an abdication. But there we are. And I still believe that despite the delays, some kind of a ground invasion will take place, and the fact that there are now growing doubts and uncertainties within Israel is actually going to increase the pressure on the political leadership to mount this operation, if only in order to still those doubts and to squelch the dissent and to rally political support behind the government and Prime Minister Netanyahu as they press forward with the war. Well, that is my worry and my fear. Over the course of that discussion on David Sacks's spaces on X, we also discussed the geopolitical aspects, the very real danger that the war could spread, that it might involve Hezbollah and ultimately the other Arab states, that it could affect the US military across the Middle East, that I expressed the view, which I have expressed previously, that the Arab states and the Iranians, their instinct will be to try to contain the war. They will not want to become directly involved, but it was acknowledged over the discussion that ultimately, whether if a ground invasion begins, the war spreads, will ultimately be determined more by events, more by the events themselves than by the political decisions leaders try to make. Because as the events begin to take shape, there is a very high prospect that the pressure on Arab and Iranian political leaders will grow, and that political discipline and the determination to stay out of a larger war will start to fray. And of course, if we then do have a general war in the Middle East, starting with a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah perhaps, but ultimately spreading to include other parties, initially Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, some of them perhaps attacking American positions in place of Israeli ones, the United States acting on its warnings given by people like Lloyd Austin to respond to such attacks. Well, it is very easy to see how in that kind of critical situation, a chain of escalation could begin, and it might, once it gets started, become extremely difficult to stop. And also, going back to that discussion which took place on David Sacks's spaces on X, a discussion, by the way, in which many other people also contributed. Elon Musk himself, by the way, was an active and extremely insightful contributor, just saying. Anyway, over the course of that same discussion, it was also acknowledged, point which I specifically made, that there is a disastrous shortage, a disastrous lack of diplomatic action, that the United States, which perhaps has the greatest responsibility to take diplomatic steps in this kind of crisis, especially when it has doubts, apparently, about what might happen and about the prospects of a ground operation in Gaza, that the United States is not fulfilling the diplomatic role that it should, and which, by the way, it has done in the past. Now, I have discussed this at length in previous programs. Alex Christoforou and I have also discussed it on the Duran. We spoke there about the fact that President Biden, when he went to the Middle East, his unqualified public support for Israel, in effect meant that the Arab leaders had no interest in speaking with him. So that summit meeting with the King of Jordan, the President of Egypt, and the President of the Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to take place in Amman, the Jordanian capital, was cancelled, obliging President Biden to return home. That President Biden compounded the problem by what I thought was a terribly misconceived address to the American people, in which he gave the impression that his focus was not on trying to prevent a larger conflict in the Middle East, but rather that he was more interested in continuing to support the other conflict, the one that's going on in Ukraine. Anyway, following that, the president of the Palestinian Authority also, it turns out, didn't want to speak with President Biden and refused his call. And I've now had from, I'm going to say ultimately a Chinese source, Sofia Midkiff to be precise, but she's obtained this information from Chinese sources in China itself. I've been provided with a breakdown of what happened, a timeline of what happened during Secretary of State Blinken's trip to the Middle East. And first of all, it turns out that there was indeed a difficult meeting between Secretary Blinken and the Saudis. What I had not appreciated is that all the calls that took place during that time between the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and first of all, Secretary Blinken himself, and between the Chinese Foreign Minister and the Saudi Foreign Minister, all of this happened at the very same time that the Secretary Blinken was in Riyadh and was finding that the discussions with the Saudis were going horribly wrong, including, it turns out, his discussion with the Prime Minister and de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The overwhelming impression that I got is of a series of extraordinarily difficult meetings between the Saudis and the Chinese, the Saudis and Blinken, over the course of which the Saudis appear to have been coordinating with the Chinese. Now, that is an astonishing development and a very, for America, a very troubling one. It suggested that there was more understanding, a better sense of understanding between the Saudis and the Chinese than there was between the Saudis and the Americans, which is an extraordinary development, and that the Saudis, confronted with Blinken and the things that Blinken had to say, apparently with Blinken once again resisting proposals for a ceasefire and instead trying to narrow the entire discussion to a discussion of the release of the hostages. Well, confronted with all of this, the Chinese and the Saudis seem to have been in contact with each other, leading to Wang Yi becoming, in effect, directly involved in the discussions with Blinken. And it seems clear that it was in fact Blinken who called Wang Yi, not the other way round. And I do wonder whether that was because Blinken himself sensed that all of these discussions between the Saudis and the Chinese were underway, and in frustration decided that he needed to speak to Wang Yi directly in order to try to get through to the Chinese and to try to sway the Chinese in a way that might perhaps have some influence on the Saudis. If that is correct, then I suspect that it will have annoyed the Saudis even more. And it seems that Wang Yi's call to the Saudi foreign minister, well, it looks like it was an attempt afterwards by the Chinese and the Saudis to show to the Americans and to make public the fact that they were speaking from the same page. And it could very well be that the Chinese decision to withhold an English language readout of this telephone exchange between Blinken and Wang Yi is in some way connected to the intense embarrassments and difficulties of all of these complex diplomatic exchanges. Well, the aftermath of that was Blinken's visit to Egypt, where, of course, he was taken to task by President al-Sisi in public. And given what happened previously in Riyadh and the fact that the Egyptians and the Saudis are apparently in close liaison with each other, both countries are planning to join are joining the BRICS at the start of next year. Well, perhaps that's not so surprising. So we can already see how American failure to conduct diplomacy, effectively, to talk to Arab leaders and to others in a constructive way, is compounding the problems and increasing the sense of crisis, and is achieving the opposite of what are perhaps American strategic objectives, which is to retain control of the diplomatic situation in the Middle East. We see that the Saudis appear to be liaising with the Chinese and appear to be on the same page with the Chinese, and that it is in fact the Americans who are being pushed out. And all of this is coming at a time when relations between the United States and the two other nuclear superpowers, Russia and China, are bad. In the one case, with Russia, they are disastrous. In the case of China, they are pretty awful as well. And that also is making diplomatic action from the United States extremely difficult at source. Once upon a time, not so long ago, in a crisis like this, there would have been American envoys visiting all of the Arab capitals. There would have been discussions between the United States and the Russians, discussions between the United States and the Chinese. Everybody would have understood clearly both what each side wanted to see come out of this crisis. They would have probably found a way of at least coming to a common position on certain fundamental things, such as avoiding an escalation of the war. And they would also have understood better what it was that all the various parties, everybody, intended to do, but perhaps even more importantly, what they did not intend to do. Now, after I made my program yesterday, reports started to come from Russia that the Russians are now complaining publicly that these enormous American military deployments are in fact aggravating the situation. They're not calming it. The Russian Foreign Ministry is openly talking about this, and one senses that behind all of this, the Russians are alarmed by the fact that the United States, again, is not making clear its intentions. The Russians have troops in Syria, as I discussed in my program yesterday and in other programs, and they have also forged close relationships with Iran and with some of the Arab states. Iran also is due to enter the BRICS. The Russians are working towards establishing close economic and political cooperation with Iran. There are now reports of military cooperation between Iran and Russia. The Russians have imported drones, geranium drones from, or Shahid drones from Iran, and they've established production facilities for those drones in Russia, and they've been used very actively in the conflict in Ukraine. And there are lots of reports that the Russians are working towards establishing a closer military relationship with Iran. So, given that that is so, the question of whether these huge American forces that are appearing in the Middle East might be used in a conflict with Iran obviously begins to become important to Russia. The Russians now have clear interests in Iran, and they must be becoming increasingly concerned about the long-term situation in Iran and its relationships with the United States and with Israel. And what the Russians almost certainly do not know is whether the United States does have a plan in case the conflict escalates to attack Iran, and if it does intend to attack Iran, how extensive that attack would be. Would it be, for example, an attack merely intended to deter? Would it be something on a much bigger scale? Might it be intended ultimately to undermine the Iranian government, to create a political crisis in Iran, something which would not please the Russians at all? But of course the Russians almost certainly don't know the answer to this, and they're left guessing, and in a situation as volatile as this one, it is very, very dangerous to leave great power rivals, nuclear powers, in a position where they have to guess. Once upon a time, the Americans and the Russians would have been in contact. The Americans would have explained what their red lines with respect to Iran were. The Russians would have done the same. There would have been assurances from the United States that whatever plans the United States might have with respect to Iran would only be activated in the event that the Iranians took certain steps, and the Russians would have been given some idea of what those steps might be. And the Americans would also have explained the extent or the limit of what it was with Iran that they intended to do. And the Russians would have been able to calibrate their response accordingly And of course, they would have consulted the Iranians, and they might have put pressure on the Iranians to try to get the Iranians to avoid crossing whatever red lines the Americans might have. And that would have been diplomacy. And of course, it would not have just related to Russia and Iran. It would have extended right across all of the various parties in the Middle East. So, to give a further example, it's likely that the Iranians also do not know what American plans are, not just with respect to themselves, but with respect to Hezbollah, this very powerful militia in Lebanon, which is a close ally of Iran, and probably the Iranians also don't know what American plans are with respect to Syria. What everybody can see is that these huge forces are being concentrated in the Middle East, but they're being left guessing as to what the Americans intend to do with them. And this is dangerous, all the more so because it's not clear to me that the Americans themselves fully know what they're going to do with these forces. Outwardly, the US says that these forces are there to deter, but given the uncertainty, it's equally plausible that with these forces being gathered, their presence is not going to deter so much as provoke and lead to other actors taking what they might see as precautionary steps in advance of a potential American attack, which could lead to a further escalation. So we've already had that warning from President Putin that he's deployed MiG-31 fighter jets to the Black Sea, and that these have the capability to launch hypersonic Kinjal missiles within range of American carrier groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we've also seen reports that Iran is now deploying its missile forces to their launch positions in case they have to be activated suddenly. So, in this kind of situation where there is uncertainties and doubts about, on the part of each side, about what the other side is doing, about the limits of what the other side is going to do, the situation becomes tense and more dangerous, and in a sense, these very delays on the part of Israel in terms of its actions in Gaza are probably increasing the tension even more. Now, coming back to the Chinese, they have been, again, very active. Yesterday, the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, spoke to the Foreign Minister of Palestine, and he reassured the Palestinians, and I say the Foreign Minister of Palestine, I should make it clear by that I mean the Foreign Minister of the Palestinian Authority. Of course, China, like Russia, recognizes the Palestinian Authority as the government of a future Palestinian state, and they have relations with it. Anyway, Wang Yi telephoned the Palestinian Foreign Minister, Mr. Maliki, and we see that Wang Yi again spoke about China's deep sympathies with the difficult situation of Palestine, especially the people of Gaza. China strongly condemns and opposes all acts that harm civilians and violate international law, and calls for an immediate ceasefire and an end to the war to ensure the most basic living conditions for the people of Gaza. And Wang Yi then went on to say the United Nations Security Council should assume its responsibilities and the international community must act urgently. Countries outside the region, especially major powers, should uphold objectivity and impartiality and play a constructive role in cooling down the crisis. And that, of course, is a clear reference again to the United States, the worries that everybody has about what the Americans are doing, or perhaps more correctly, not doing. What do all of these American military concentrations in the Middle East, what do they imply? What are the limits, especially, of what the Americans intend to do? And of course, Wang Yi went on to say that the only way to solve the Palestinian issue, it lies in implementing the two-state solution and realizing the Palestinian people's rights to survival, and note that he uses the expression survival, statehood, and return. Now, return could imply the ultimate return of the Palestinian refugees dispersed across the Middle East, something which up to now Israel has been adamantly opposed to. But we see that China is steadily shifting towards stronger support for the Palestinian position. And we go on to learn that China calls for the convening of a more authoritative, larger scale, and more effective international peace conference as soon as possible, promoting the resumption of peace talks between Palestine and Israel as soon as possible, and formulating a specific timetable and roadmap for this purpose. So we see that the Chinese are continuing to push hard their idea of an international peace conference to resolve the crisis in the Middle East, not just the immediate crisis, but the long-term crisis between the Israelis and the Palestinians. They're already giving pointers to what they want to see, not just statehood for the Palestinians, but return, a difficult thing for Israel to accept, but that increasingly looks like the Chinese position. And to come back to this readout, what they want is a comprehensive, fair and lasting solution to the Palestinian issue at an early date. So that is the first of two conversations that Wang Yi has had over the last 2 days. And then after that conversation, or perhaps in conjunction with it, Wang Yi also spoke to the Foreign Minister of Israel, Mr. Cohen. And the readout of this conversation, by the way, I should say that both of these readouts still, so far as I'm aware, only exist in Chinese. The Chinese have still not provided English language readouts, and I want to again thank Sofia Midkiff for forwarding these readouts to me. Anyway, we see that the Chinese have repeated the same formulas to the Israelis, though Wang Yi went out of his way to make it clear over the course of this conversation that, of course, China does not support the violent actions taken by Hamas. We condemn all acts that harm civilians and oppose any violations of international law. That's from the Chinese readout of the conversation with Mr. Cohen. All countries have the right to self-defense, but they should abide by international humanitarian law and protect the safety of civilians. The top priority is to prevent the situation from escalating further and leading to a more serious humanitarian disaster. So Wang Yi is telling Cohen, we completely accept that you have a right to self-defense. You cannot, however, resolve it and should not even think of resolving it in ways that violate international humanitarian law through the displacement of the population of Gaza or through a large-scale bombing offensive of Gaza, which, of course, to a great extent is already taking place, which leads to mass civilian casualties. And the priority is to prevent the situation from further escalating and leading to a more serious humanitarian disaster. And over the course of it, again, Wang Yi brought up the issue of a long-term solution to this problem. Wang Yi emphasized that the painful lessons of the recurring conflict between Palestine and Israel fully demonstrate that only by adhering to the concept of common security can sustainable security be achieved. In other words, security is not a zero-sum game. Israel cannot achieve safety and security for itself and its people by denying that to the Palestinians. There has to be some kind of long-term solution that ensures the security of both the security and safety of both Israelis and Palestinians, whilst acknowledging their respective rights. And he says that only by adhering to the direction of political settlement can Israel's legitimate security concerns be thoroughly resolved. And then he goes on to say, the Chinese readout goes on to say that the two-state solution is the consensus of the international community, and China hopes that both Palestine and Israel will proceed from the long-term interests of peace and security for the present and future generations, return to the right track of the two-state solution as soon as possible, resume peace talks, and realize the realization of two states, Palestine and Israel, peaceful coexistence, and the harmonious coexistence of the Arab and Jewish nations. And the readout finishes by saying that Wang Yi assured Cohen that China has no selfish interests in the Palestinian issue and sincerely hopes that it will be resolved in a comprehensive and just manner. So we see Chinese at least taking steps, but note again that the immediate objectives are now being clearly set out: an immediate ceasefire, and then further moves towards setting up this international peace conference, which of course China will participate, and in which both Israel and the Palestinians will be represented. An international peace conference which is intended to chart the way towards a long-term sustainable peace, a rapprochement between these two nations, the Palestinians and the Israelis, which Wang Yi says is the only way to achieve a long-term, stable, sustainable peace in the Middle East. Now, there will be many, many people in Israel who are not happy with much of this, and I recognize that. But of course, the Chinese are not just weighing in, they're weighing in for a purpose, because also their objective is to, as I've said already, take control of the diplomatic process in the Middle East away from the Americans. And we see that the Chinese are making inroads. I've already discussed this very complex, indeed I would say all but disastrous visit by Blinken to Saudi Arabia, and the way in which the Chinese seem to have been engaged in the discussions that took place during that same visit. And we've already seen a succession of moves in the Security Council. And I have discussed how the Russians and the Brazilians, in proposing resolutions that appeared to show a common position, gave every sign of coordinating with each other. And surprise to surprise, yesterday we had a telephone conversation between the Russian and Brazilian presidents, President Putin and Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. And the Kremlin has provided a readout, and it covers various topics, including BRICS and Ukraine. But of course, the leading discussion, the main point of discussion, was the situation in the Middle East. And this is what the readout says. The rapidly deteriorating situation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was discussed in detail, with deep concern expressed for the growing number of civilian casualties and emphasis on the critical importance of rapidly achieving a ceasefire, evacuating foreign citizens from the Gaza Strip, and ensuring unhindered access of humanitarian aid to the enclave. Given Brazil's presidency of the UN Security Council this month, various aspects of joint work were considered, with a view to taking urgent and effective measures through the United Nations to de-escalate the crisis and meaningfully advance the peace process via the generally accepted international legal framework that provides for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state coexisting in peace and security with Israel. So there you have it. Open admission from the Russians and the Brazilians. The call, by the way, apparently initiated by the Brazilians. An open admission, straightforwardly set out in a Russian readout, that the Brazilians and the Russians are working together and coordinating. Given Brazil's presidency of the UN Security Council this month, various aspects of joint work were considered. And the end point is the same one expressed by their other BRICS partner, Wang Yi, in his discussions with Blinken, with the Saudi foreign minister, and also in Wang Yi's calls yesterday with the foreign ministers of the Palestinian Authority and of Israel. Effective measures through the UN to de-escalate the crisis and meaningfully advance the peace process via the generally accepted international legal framework that provides for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Now, I should say that this call probably found Lula in a confident mood. Now, at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg in August, it's fairly well known that Brazil lobbied for the BRICS to issue an invitation to Argentina, an ally at present of Brazil. These two countries have apparently not always been close friends, but the Brazilian government, Lula's government, is on good terms with the current government in Argentina. Anyway, it's fairly well known that Brazil lobbied for an invitation to be extended to Argentina to join the BRICS. And the other BRICS states went along with that. They all agreed, despite the fact that there were some concerns about granting BRICS membership to Argentina, which is at the moment going through a major economic and inflation crisis. And it's also fairly well known that some of the other BRIC states were seriously worried about the long-term stability of the current Argentine government. There's a process of presidential and parliamentary elections underway currently in Argentina, and given the economic crisis, it was widely expected that the current government would lose those elections and that Argentina would elect a new government which was not favourable to the BRICS and which would realign Argentina with the United States and with the West. And in fact, the leading opposition candidate, if I can call him that, a firebrand economist and radical, who was widely expected to top the poll in the first round of the election in Argentina, which took place on Sunday. He has actually not only made it clear that he wants Argentina to distance itself from China and end its BRICS membership bid, but that he wants to replace the Argentine peso as Argentina's currency with a dollar, and he wants to carry out very radical market reforms and big cuts in government spending in Argentina. So there was a real concern that despite Lula's lobbying and Argentina's decision to make its BRICS membership bid, there was real concern among some of the BRICS states that having issued this invitation to Argentina, Argentina might actually reverse it, and after the election might decide that he didn't want to be a member of the BRICS after all, which would have been embarrassing, and of course most embarrassing of all for President Lula da Silva. Well, in the event, there has been the first round of elections in Argentina, and the candidate of the existing left-of-centre government, or leftist government, whichever you prefer, the Peronist government in Argentina, he topped the poll quite comfortably, and the Peronist party also won a substantial victory, apparently, in the elections in the Argentine capital, Buenos Aires. Now, the election is not ended, and I'm not going to predict its outcome. I'm not an expert on Argentinian politics, but the general feeling now is that it is more likely than not that the present government will in fact continue, that it will win the elections, and that this challenge from the pro-American right, if I can put it like that, will be defeated. As I said, I'm not absolutely certain that this is the case, but that is how it looks. And that will, of course, have given President Lula more confidence, would have buoyed him up in advance of this conversation with Putin. But anyway, the key takeaway from all of this is that the Russians and the Brazilians are working together on the Security Council. So, of course, are the Chinese. And as I've said already, we are looking at a complex chess game being played out in the Security Council. And with the doubts, the uncertainties about the Israeli military operation apparently growing in the United States, but with the Israelis likely to launch that military operation anyway in Gaza, eventually, sooner or later, we will see that resolution backed by all of the BRICS states and commanding wider support across the entire international community being put before the Security Council, with the United States risking isolation if it vetoes it, and with the massive potential embarrassment that that same resolution could be convened, could be presented to the UN General Assembly, perhaps with the General Assembly being convened for an extraordinary meeting, and quite plausibly, given the statements that UN officials, including UN Secretary General Guterres, are making, with this resolution being supported by the UN Secretariat. And of course, as I've discussed many times, General Assembly resolutions are advisory, they're not binding in the way that Security Council resolutions are. There is the mechanism of uniting for peace. It hasn't been used since 1979, and its very legality is open to some doubt. But one way or the other, if a resolution like that passes through the Security Council, it is highly plausible that the United States, finding itself isolated in the General Assembly, in the United Nations on this issue, facing the real prospect of a collapse of support for its position on issues like Ukraine. And there is, by the way, another article in today's New York Times saying how countries in the global south are increasingly complaining about US double standards. The US preaching one thing about the conflict in Ukraine, practicing the opposite in the conflict in the Middle East. Anyway, the United States, finding itself isolated, might perforce be obliged to accept that resolution. The risk the United States runs is not just of a diplomatic defeat and perhaps a major humiliation on the Ukraine issue, but of course the risk that it will lose control, that it will be marginalized in the diplomatic process in the Middle East, that the resolution will not only call for a ceasefire and the release of hostages and such things, but that it will also make moves towards setting up this international conference that Wang Yi and the Chinese are talking about. And by the way, that it could also open up the route for further resolutions by what will at that point become the global majority in connection with the conflict in Ukraine, which the United States might not like. Well, I will discuss all of that last in other programs. But anyway, that is the risk the United States runs, and we can already see that when I say that the US faces the risk of international isolation, France, on this issue, already appears to be shifting its position. France supported the Brazilian draft resolution on the Security Council when it was presented a few days ago, and the French President Emmanuel Macron, who has now arrived in Israel, he is also apparently calling on the Israelis to delay their operation in Gaza and to prioritize the release of the hostages there. And one senses that he, at least, Macron, is becoming also increasingly concerned about the overall position, though, as is always the case with Macron, he says things and in the end never follows through. But for what it's worth, we see that he is starting to wobble, and I suspect that more European states will eventually do so as well. I would add that Italy is another country where the situation is far from clear-cut. The present Italian Foreign Minister, Giorgia Meloni, is a staunch supporter of Israel, and by the way, also a staunch supporter of Ukraine. On both issues, she's out of tune with wider sentiment in Italy, or so I understand. And there are now growing doubts also about her economic policies and concerns that she's overspending and that Italy's debt position is becoming unsustainable, and that Italy could soon be facing a major sovereign debt crisis, not entirely dissimilar to the ones that we saw following the financial crisis in 2008. So perhaps it might be unwise to assume too much about the long-term stability of Meloni's position as Prime Minister. After all, changes of Prime Minister in Italy are hardly rare, in which case it's not at all impossible that Italy might flip, and in doing so, it would have the support of countries like, for example, Spain. So we can start to see how EU solidarity might start to unravel under the pressure of events. And of course, there's also the prospect of protests in other EU states, in countries like Britain and Germany, despite the attempts of governments there to hold the line, and indeed, by the way, to make increasingly illiberal and, in my opinion, inappropriate comments and measures which, to my mind, appear to restrict the right to protest. So we can see how this whole situation is not playing out well at all, how the doubts continue to be there, how too much for comfort is being staked on a quick military solution in Gaza, how neocon opinion, which, as I've said many times, has no reverse gear, wants to perhaps press for extreme outcomes. Alex and Christoforou and I did a program on the Duran in which we discussed how it does increasingly look as if some people in the United States, perhaps the predominant feeling in the United States, is that the US and Israel need to move fast to resolve their general security problems once and for all, and since they don't want to compromise, do so by military means. And that does perhaps offer a clue about what all of these military deployments are about. Well, if that is the route followed, and it does amount to escalation, massive escalation, there is a risk, huge risk, that this could, in military terms, go terribly wrong. And we can already see, with all of these various steps, the Chinese, the Russians, the Brazilians, and others are taking, how that could also lead to a massive diplomatic and geopolitical defeat as well. And that would be a geopolitical defeat taking place at the same time as a military defeat continues to loom in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is not getting the attention that it merits. The crisis there is not getting the attention that it merits because it's been overshadowed by the events in the Middle East, and it is not getting the attention that it merits on this channel either. But suffice to say that photographic and film evidence has now been provided by presumably people in Russia, military people in Russia, which does appear to confirm that the Russians have now consolidated control over the Slag heap near the Avdeyevka coking plant. There are also further reports that the Ukrainians are now under intense pressure to avoid the collapse in Avdeyevka, are obliged to redeploy forces from other fronts. I've discussed how it seems that Leopard 2 tanks have already been seen operating in the Avdeyevka area, and there was confirmation today that elements of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the one that was supplied with the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and the Leopard 2 tanks, the brigade that was supposed to break through the Russian defenses in Zaporozhye region and open the way to the advance towards the Sea of Azov. Anyway, it's now confirmed that at least some elements of this brigade, which has, by the way, been badly shattered over the course of the fighting and which has had its commander replaced, anyway, that elements of this brigade have been hurriedly redeployed towards Avdeyevka, and that Ukraine has also been obliged to redeploy troops, especially artillery units, from the Bakhmut area to Avdeyevka as well. And going back to my discussion in my program yesterday, I said that even more perhaps than the objective of capturing Avdeyevka itself, it seemed to me that the Russians, by attacking Avdeyevka, a linchpin point in Ukraine's defense system in Donbass, appear to be intent on inflicting attrition on the Ukrainians, forcing the Ukrainians to deploy more and more forces to defend a point that they feel they cannot simply abandon. And we see how that is happening, how Ukraine is being forced to redeploy units from the Zaporozhye front and from Bakhmut to try to hold the line in Avdeyevka, and that the result is, inevitably, that its positions in both Zaporozhye and Bakhmut appear to be weakening. And all of this, by the way, comes alongside a very tantalizing report. In fact, it's not a report, it's an announcement by Ukraine that it is carrying out a mass evacuation of children from the area of Kherson region on the west bank of the Dnieper, which it controls. Now, Ukraine has been trying to launch amphibious assaults across the Dnieper into the eastern part of Kherson region controlled by Russia. I've discussed these attacks in various programs. I've said that they seem to me to be somewhat underpowered. They don't appear to be making any progress. There were reports yesterday that the Ukrainians, after being pushed back to the river edge, tried to send more troops across the railway bridge, the Antonovsky railway bridge, onto the east bank, that there's been more fighting, and the Russians today were saying that these attacks have been repelled. Of course, we have no exact confirmation of this, but this does seem to be happening. At least there does seem to be increasing fighting there. But perhaps putting aside the actual land battles on the Dnieper's edge, which do not seem to be very large or involve large numbers of troops, but which do not appear to be achieving any objectives at the moment, any Ukrainian objectives at the moment. there's now a massive accumulation of reports of very heavy Russian artillery strikes and air bombardments of Ukrainian military positions on the west bank of the Dnieper in the parts of Kherson region which are under Ukrainian control. And Ukrainian officials themselves are now speaking in worried terms about this, and this does seem to be in some way related to the evacuation of these children, and it does increasingly look as if the Ukrainians are taking incredibly heavy losses again in this area, achieving very little, and perhaps, now this is very tentative and might be entirely wrong, but just perhaps possibly worrying that the Russians not only are fighting a defensive battle in this area, but that they have offensive intentions themselves, and that they might at some point decide that the time has come for them to attack and counterattack and bring their own forces over to the East Bank and to try to push the Ukrainians back from the Dnieper. Well, we will have to see. But what is the case is that again yesterday, major Russian missile and drone attacks took place across Ukraine, including in places like Dnipro and other towns in northeastern Ukraine. And I've been discussing the claims, I've discussed in recent programs, the claims the Russians are making that they've been successful in shooting down more and more Ukrainian aircraft. And I had a most interesting suggestion, email from another member of the Duran community. I'm not going to identify this person, but this person suggested to me that this reflects Russian air patrols over the Black Sea, that they actually began before Putin said, and that MiG-31 fighter jets have been operating over the Black Sea. It's been striking that over the last couple of days, Ukrainian missile strikes towards Crimea have become increasingly less effective. I've already said that these MiG-31s, with their enormous radars, are purpose designed to shoot down cruise missiles, and it might be that it's their presence that is enabling the Russians to detect these cruise missiles, and to shoot them down more expeditiously. But it could also be that these enormously powerful MiG interceptors, with their extremely effective long-ranged radars, are, through their patrols in the Black Sea, able to reach out further, deeper into Ukrainian territory, and that it is this is the reason that these Ukrainian fighter jets are being shot down. They are being shot down by the MiGs over the Black Sea, operating with these very long-range cruise air-to-air missiles. And that, it seems to me, is a real possibility. But anyway, deteriorating military situation, but also a deteriorating logistical situation as well. And there have been suddenly a flurry of articles and commentaries about this. So Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Prime Minister Mr. Shmyhal, has admitted that there is a desperate shortage of shells in Ukraine, and he says that there is a worldwide shortage of shells. There's an article in the Financial Times which talks about Ukraine's race to set up its own arms production industry. I've already discussed, as has Eve Smith, on Naked Capitalism, why that is essentially a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. And one senses that it is indeed the case that Ukraine is facing increasing shortages of ammunition. And of course, all of this is coming as Ukraine looks like it's facing competition for shells from Israel, which most likely will gain priority. And then there is the issue of human losses as well. I've discussed in recent programs, or at least in my latest program, how Ukraine is not only trying to step up its mobilization of men, including students and younger men and men with disabilities, but is now also mobilizing increasing numbers of women who I suspect do not have the previous training that proper reservists might be expected to have. And to be clear, I think these recruitments of very young people and of women are a tragedy, which is going to worsen Ukraine's future in almost all respects. But beyond that, what we see is this huge Russian buildup, more and more Russian soldiers, men, voluntarily joining the Russian armed forces. There's now said to be 357,000 men who've signed contracts with the Russian military since the start of the year. Huge build-up going on in Russia, and we see Ukraine becoming increasingly forced to take desperate measures to try to keep up. And I saw a most interesting chart, or interactive map, if you like, or virtual map on Slavyangrad about relative mobilizations by Ukraine and Russia. And it was very insightful, even though it only covered the situation for 2022. In other words, for last year. It showed that at the start of the special military operation, the Russian and Ukrainian forces were relatively evenly matched in terms of numbers. Ukraine had rather more than the Russians did at that time, but overall there was relative balance in terms of numbers. Then Ukraine went through multiple mobilizations in the spring of summer of last year, and that brought the total number of its forces to around 800,000. And at this point, Ukraine outnumbered the Russians by around 2-1. Numbers of troops, Ukrainian troops, outnumbered the Russians by a ratio of around 2-1. And I'm going to suggest that this is what ultimately explains Ukraine's success in those offensives last year in Kharkov and Kherson region. The Ukrainians outnumbered the Russians across the entire theatre. That meant that they could outnumber the Russians very heavily in areas where they chose to concentrate forces, such as in Kharkov and Kherson region. And that, more than any tactical skill on the part of Ukraine, was what enabled the Ukrainians to achieve the gains that they did in those offensives. But they lost many men, many resources in doing so. They found themselves significantly reduced in total numbers by the end of the year. They were not able to press home the success that they achieved in the autumn of last year, when the military balance was most favorable to themselves. And ever since then, week by week, month by month, the balance has been shifting further and further towards the Russians. Now, before long, the Russians will have more troops than Ukraine does. And they might, for all I know, already do so. And at that point, Ukraine's problems will become critical. I should say that I was not aware last year of the extent to which Ukraine had mobilized larger forces than the Russians did. I only began to sense it towards the end of last year. And it also needs to be said that the first person to understand the extent of the Ukrainian build-up that took place last year and of the military support that Ukraine was receiving from the United States was Scott Ritter, and comments that he made to that effect in the spring of 2022 were vindicated by events. But since then, as I said, we've seen that the balance has increasingly started to shift. So at some point, with the Russians comprehensively outnumbering the Ukrainians, the balance on the battlefields will change. There's been much talk about how difficult it is to mount offensives in modern warfare, that minefields and drones and all those kind of things make it very difficult to launch a successful offensive. I'm going to say in my own inexpert way that what makes the difference in offensives, the success of offensives, is not technologies, which can always be countered, but numbers. It has always been so throughout the history of war. Ukraine was successful last year, partially successful last year, because it heavily outnumbered the Russians at that time. It has been unsuccessful this year because Russian numbers have began to catch up, so that the Ukrainians were never able to achieve breakthroughs in any one place because the Russians always had reserves to counter them. And next year, the balance will have shifted in favor of the Russians. So, geopolitical catastrophe looming in the Middle East, not perhaps an existential one, but one very humiliating, and a potential geopolitical catastrophe looming in Ukraine as well. No wonder, according to the Axios article that I discussed yesterday, US officials are now worried. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and of course X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop and see the amazing things that you will find there as well. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.